It is to have been asked to do this, and I think very interesting to have someone who spent a decade working on gendered violence and someone who spent the better part of their adult life working on the environment, to see how these two seemingly disparate issues actually interconnect, and how all of the seemingly disparate issues in our world interconnect, which Joëlle brings to life so beautifully in this book. And I'm just going to try not to spend the evening in tears because I have digested this so completely. And can I just say, to begin with, that it is a remarkable achievement. I was sitting with a group of victim survivors of sexual violence in Geelong today, of all places, and they were talking about how they sought healing after they'd been subjected to almost unspeakable acts of violence. And we sat and talked and cried together, and what they were saying was what gave them resilience and hope and the ability to thrive and survive was to be in a group with one another, and that they were amongst other people who had been through what they had been through. And as I was in that group and thinking about tonight and thinking about how do we gird ourselves for the information that Joëlle has to bring us, is that we are all here together, and I want us to really take the spirit of communion that Joelle's book offers us and really see ourselves as sitting here together going through an experience, and that we are all living through this together. And it is a necessary process to feel grief in order for us to come to understanding and action. And I think I personally have been avoiding that for some time. So I think this idea of grieving in rawness altogether is what Joelle's book is offering us, and that this communion is in fact the only thing that will end up saving us and our planet. So I want to start just by talking about grief, because I definitely went through all the stages of grief reading your book. So I'm not going to name all of them, but denial, bargaining. There's one part in the book that's like, you say that there's this thing that we might cause 3 degrees of cooling, and I'm like, oh, well, that would offset the warming. And then you're like, this is a disastrous scenario. I'm like, shit. Like, I'm looking for the loophole that Joëlle hadn't found. But that last part, acceptance, it's the first time I think I've ever come to a sense of acceptance of what has happened, but what we can still save. So thank you for that. And I just want to ask you, can you tell me what it was like for you to write this book and the grief process you've been through?
Yeah, of course. Well, firstly, it's really wonderful to be here this evening, and thanks for the terrific turnout, and it's amazing to be here with you, Jess. So I guess this book really came about from the immense privilege of working at that United Nations level, being one of the 12 Australians involved in this assessment report, which was really a massive global stocktake of the state of the planet. And as I started to piece this information together with my colleagues, we really started to see this pattern that was emerging that was really something you really couldn't avoid. And as an Australian, I mean, obviously I'm an expert in my field of science where I live, but when you actually see the global jigsaw puzzle and you're piecing all these pieces together, it really just pops out. And the thing about this book is that as I was writing it, there were a whole range of different extremes that were unfolding. Firstly, we saw the Black Summer bushfires. I'd literally just got back from an IPCC meeting in southern France, in Toulouse. Came back and the eastern seaboard was on fire. And during that particular event, about 25% of Australia's forests burnt in a single bushfire season. So we saw about 3 billion animals either killed or displaced. And as a result of that, we've now got the koala listed as an endangered species in this country. Now just stop and have a bit of a think about what that means. Our most iconic mammal is now endangered. And here in New South Wales, the koala could become extinct as soon as 2050. So that happened, and that was in a single bushfire season. And then we also saw back-to-back bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. Many of you would know that about 50% of the Great Barrier Reef has actually died off since 2015. And that doesn't even include the last two mass bleaching events of 2020 and 2022. So just to give you an indication that we're sort of seeing this large-scale ecological collapse that's occurring on our watch. And then, of course, just kept coming, the catastrophic flooding of the East Coast. So I live in the Northern Rivers region. My husband's from the town of Lismore, and effectively that town has been wiped off the map. And just to see all of this unfolding as I was writing this book was really an experience where I felt like there was no distinction between my personal and professional life. So what I was seeing on the page was just springing to life, but not springing to life at the end of the century or in 2050, is springing to life here and now. And I know that many people probably in the audience have some kind of appreciation of what that might be like. I think the Black Summer was a real turning point in this country in terms of at least awareness of just how serious and urgent climate change is. But then, of course, coronavirus came through and everyone switched their attention and holed up in their own homes, and we sort of forgot about the climate crisis. But the thing is that it's here and it's happening, and it's one of these things that collectively as a nation, I think we're ready to have this conversation. So for me, I really felt compelled to effectively share all the information that I had at my fingertips as a lead author on this IPCC report. But really, the process of writing that book was, I literally finished work on the IPCC assessment report. I finished my teaching. I teach climatology, 220 students at the Australian National University, and then just dove straight into writing this book. And it was an intense process, obviously. And so I basically had to write my own process through it to be able to keep going, really. And so I suppose it's really just coming to terms with the fact that we're living through this really profoundly transformative moment in our species' history. And really what happens next is very much in our hands. And so I really felt compelled to sort of sound the alarm, to let people know that in fact the Earth's climate is destabilising. And that's something that we have to realise is happening here right now on our watch. And we are the generation that is actually bearing witness to that. And so that's huge. And so for me, even as a scientist, and I'm really immersed in this work, but when you see it on that global level, it really was something I couldn't unsee, and it became something that I felt absolutely compelled to write about, because it's not enough for people like me to be walking around with this information in my mind. I felt like I had to share it. And so it was a really, there's a real sense of urgency in this book that I brought to it. So it was one of those things that I just felt like was in me, and it had to go out there in the world.
And I think that, you say you had to sound the alarm. Lots of climate scientists have been sounding the alarm with more or less effect for the last 20 to 30 years, What you do is you ring a visceral alarm, in the sense that you show how it is moving through your body, through your relationships with other people. It's like you give the reader permission to feel, and that feeling is not separate to understanding the science, that this is actually part of it, that if we don't allow ourselves to grieve, and that we will stop ourselves, as you write, we'll stop ourselves from emotionally processing the reality of our loss, and it prevents us from facing the changes that we need to make to the way we live and to respond to our new reality with an open heart. And I've certainly found that to be the case. I've almost been too scared to read about climate change, and I have to say that your book is the first time in 10 years of being in and around this reporting that I've ever felt truly held and taken through a process where I felt I could come back to this movement.
Wow, that's incredible feedback. Thank you, Jess. Honestly, that really means a lot to me. I think as scientists, we are really expected to do our work in a way that I think is really disconnected from our emotions. And, many of us can be rational and logical, and we do all of that sort of work, but we also have an emotional response to the things that we're seeing unfold. And I sort of think that medical practitioners, when they have patients that are dying on their watch, no one calls them an alarmist and says, oh, you guys are just being, a bit too emotional about that.
Cancer's not that bad.
Yeah.
I'll show you the other research. It shows it's good for you. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. But as climate scientists, we are considered to be alarmist if we're saying that we're watching the collapse of these incredible ecosystems. Like the Great Barrier Reef is the largest living organism on the planet, and that's collapsing right now. And it's very likely, within the next sort of 10 to 20 years, that's going to be an entirely transformed ecosystem, right? So how could you not have a response to that? And sometimes, if you watch David Attenborough documentaries, and it occurred to me one day that this is archival footage. This is a glimpse of a lost world that one day we'll look back at this time and think, what did we do? But the thing about the IPCC experience for me, and this is really another reason why I was really motivated to write this, is that how bad we let things get is still up to us, right? So that's one of the headline statements from our report. So sometimes commentators in this space can go off and get into doomism and really feel like it is all just completely hopeless and unfixable. But that's actually not the case. And so I guess it's just letting people know that really it's still in our hands, and that could be a moment which we step up to, and instead of this destruction and leaving this destruction in our wake, we could leave a legacy of care and repair, that we could actually choose to be this generation that steps up to this enormous challenge. And then, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, but I think it's worth mentioning now, so I don't completely destroy the audience, is that I started to look back over history, and I realised that all these great social movements throughout human history have been this sort of tug of war between people either removing or providing the social licence for something to continue to occur. And so whether it be, gender equality or a whole range of different sort of civil rights movements, all that sort of thing, it was this common theme that kept coming out. And I realised with the environmental movement that this is actually the most revolutionary moment that we're living through. And you know how people look back at the 1960s and think, oh wow, that was just such an incredible time of social change, and well, we're going to look back at the 2020s as well and think, how did I show up in that moment? And so I feel that there's something that really connects us with a sense of our past, and I think that can be a really empowering thing to realise that not everyone's going to be on board with this. There's always going to be people that just for their own reasons just don't really get it or oppose it in some way. But it turns out you only really need 25% of a population to shift a social norm, which I thought was really good, because it means that you effectively just need a critical mass.
It's not so hard.
It's not so hard.
There are many characters in your book. You are one of them. The IPCC and its authors is a major character. What is it like to work on the IPCC report, and the fact that it is voluntary, by the way, all of this work is done voluntarily, which blew my mind. And what did you learn during the incredibly arduous process of writing the last one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's a United Nations process, and so around 1,000 different scientists around the world were nominated to be a part of this process, and I was one of those scientists from my region. And then about 242 authors were selected, and there were 12 of us from the Australian region, and from 66 different countries. So it really genuinely was a United Nations process. In my chapter team alone, there were people from Russia, Colombia, France, China. It was a really extraordinary process. And as Jess said, it's a voluntary post, so we don't get funding to participate. We basically provide our expertise, and we all work together in a way that is, it was an extraordinary opportunity, because the altruism of these people is just amazing.
Explain, you open the book with the fact that you're getting out of bed at 5:30 a.m. again to do a online meeting with the IPCC scientists. It's the level of commitment, the number of just edits on the chapter is just intimidating.
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of a background on the numbers, so there are 13 chapters in the volume I was involved in, and each of those are like 80,000 words each. So you're looking at a report that's over 1 million words. And there are 3 main volumes, and then there are 3 supplementary volumes, and then there's a synthesis report, right? So just to give you an idea of just the sheer volume of work that is involved in that. And obviously the first 3 meetings we met in person, because as you can imagine with so many different time zones, it makes sense to be in the room. But when COVID hit, our 4th lead author meeting had to shift online, as did all of our chapter meetings. And obviously being one of the few people from the Southern Hemisphere, sometimes it would be 5 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
Always, yeah.
Always. Or 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, or 6 p.m. on a Friday night. So really the last thing I would want to be doing at the end of my working week is... in terms of the reviewer comments, we had about 75,000 reviewer comments on the report just for volume 1. And each of those comments had to be responded to. The text had to be revised, and then our response to that was also provided in a database, which is then made publicly available to be entirely transparent. And then it goes to the UN for approval, line by line, where the different nations of the world either argue or not about what we've said. And sometimes you'll get, for instance, Saudi Arabia with over 100 different interventions about certain elements of human-caused climate change that they're not quite happy with the phrasing, and so this process can go on and on
Did
and on.
that piss you off enormously?
Well, of course. I mean, it's one of these things where science stops being science and it moves into a political realm, which is really, really different. And I think for a lot of scientists, that was the hard part.
Yeah.
And because we are agonising over every single sentence, it is really, it's just... to see it starting to be pulled apart becomes a really difficult...
And by Saudi Arabia, which it's a bit like the gall, a bit...
Exactly. So just to give you an idea as well, I started that process in 2018, and the report came out in the middle of the year last year. And all the while, as I said, I was running a research group, still publishing research articles, teaching over 200 students, and then I did all of that and then wrote this book. So, yes, I am crazy, it's true.
I think the fact you've got Egyptian heritage, and having lived in Cairo, it's a good kind of crazy, and it's also a kind of like heritage that gives you an excellent sense of humour. They're the funniest people in the Middle East, the Egyptians. So let's just land feet first into the planetary crisis that we are in. Can you condense the latest IPCC report into a 3-minute answer? And I'll give you 4 minutes, but that's as much as we can allow. But what are the most important things, the top level things you think that people really need to understand?
Sure. So basically, one of the really big take-home messages from this latest assessment report is that human-caused climate change is an established fact. There's no longer any dispute about that, and so we can all move on effectively from that particular part of the discussion. But it was really strong language, and to see that included in the report is significant progress. Firstly, we have altered every single component of the climate system, from the deepest ocean trenches through to the highest mountain tops. We have managed to effectively, there's a human fingerprint on all of those activities. And so we're very clear on that. So there isn't really a part of the world that has not been touched in some way by human-caused climate change. The other thing we know is that the impacts are accelerating in terms of the sorts of extremes that we've been playing out, and I mentioned a couple of those in the Australian context, but just for a few that you might have seen in the news somewhat recently, the United Kingdom experienced 40-degree temperatures not so long ago, and last year there was 50-degree temperatures found recorded in the Arctic Circle. So that's hotter than it's ever been in a place like Alice Springs, right? So we're talking about desert-like heat in the polar latitudes, that's kind of like rewriting atmospheric science textbooks.
And the place you really need to not have heat.
Right, because we're melting the ice sheets. So when you start to do that, that starts to destabilise ocean circulation and so on. So we're seeing that. And so one of the important chapters is looking at extremes, and that was the first time that all that information was compiled into one single chapter. The other thing that's really important to know is that right now we are really falling very short of where we need to be to achieve these Paris Agreement targets. So we need to effectively try and minimise warming and lower and keep it at 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So right now we're at 1.2, and obviously we would like to try and stabilise it at 1.5 because of a whole swag of impacts that I'm happy to talk about. But right now, in terms of the currently implemented policies that are out there, we're looking at 2 to 4 degrees. And in terms of if we did implement all of those net zero emission pledges that have been put forward at the last UN climate conference, that's still only around 2 degrees. So that's still a major overshoot. That, for instance, coral reef systems at 2 degrees, you're looking at wiping out 99% of coral reef ecosystems. And coral reefs are they also house about 25% of all marine life in some form of its life cycle. So we're really talking about fundamental changes in major components of the Earth system. Between 2 and 3 degrees, we start to destabilise the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, and that really has major implications for the sea level rise that starts to play out in terms of that happens. That's an irreversible process. If we get beyond 2 degrees, that's considered an irreversible process on timescales that are relevant to sort of human societies. So then you're really looking at unleashing, metres of sea level rise. So clearly we have a problem. We have a really major problem. And just on the sea level topic, the topic of sea level, so currently there are about 250 million people that are living within about 2 metres of sea level. So that figure of exposure increases to 1 billion people the further on we go, even up till 2050. So, and right now, some of you might have seen in the media, Pakistan, about 1/3 of Pakistan is currently underwater. Just torrential monsoon floods have been, it's been crazy to observe. And lots of scientists on Twitter are commenting on that, particularly people who are involved in the sort of event attribution sort of side of things. For the report. But effectively, this is not something we're going to see playing out in some long, distant, faraway time and land, unfortunately. And as an Australian, this is the thing. I mean, I was reading all this material and I'm like, this is now. And I think until we really genuinely get that and genuinely understand what is at stake, then we're not going to turn it around. And I think that in a country like Australia, and I even quote David Attenborough in the start of the book, I mean, we are caretakers of an extraordinary part of this planet. We have more unique plants and animals here in Australia than anywhere on Earth. It's even more biodiverse than places like Brazil, Madagascar, Papua New Guinea. Australia's unbelievable. So here we are in Australia with this extraordinary country, with an extraordinary Indigenous history, the longest continuous history and culture in the world, and yet here we are, still peddling fossil fuels, still not wanting to give it up. So while the election results were fantastic, and I'm very happy to talk about that as well, I believe we saw a social tipping point, and that's something we should all be really proud of, actually, because it just goes to show that when the community really gets behind people that reflect their values, that you can shift the system. And that to me was an extraordinary thing. I mean, I stayed up till midnight watching the ABC coverage, and I was crying, and I was thinking to myself,
it was the most exciting night I've had in ages.
Yeah, that's right.
Never been so excited by a television broadcast.
Absolutely. But also absolutely. But again, as an Australian scientist, certainly as an IPCC author, what we do matters. Because if we are still wanting to export, we're the largest exporter of coal and liquefied natural gas, so we need to turn the tap off and we need to start mopping up. And that's a really, really big job. And the sooner we do that, the better, because obviously the more and more warming that we bake into the system, that starts to lock in some of these irreversible elements that people like me, that keeps me up at night. Because you really are talking about, like, if you are thinking about displacing hundreds of millions of people, that's extremely significant.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about the sinking cities of Bangkok, Jakarta, Tokyo, Shanghai and New Orleans, not to mention the Pacific and other low-lying islands, and say essentially in no uncertain terms that strategic plans will be needed to figure out where these people retreat to. And this is what I mean about Joelle's book, is that you are stepped through literally the sort of the IPCC report with someone who cares deeply both for you and for the earth and is putting that on the page, but is not holding back and telling you just how bad it's got and what we will lose unequivocally, but what we can save. And I think your analogy in the book, it meant a lot to me. When I was working in the Middle East, I was diagnosed with a brain tumour. I had a seizure on a flight back from Yemen to Beirut. I got diagnosed with a brain tumour, and you had a similar analogy in the book, which is that when you get the diagnosis from the doctor and the doctor says to you what is wrong with you, you have in that moment a moment of grief. And it's not the grief that you're necessarily going to die, but you do know that you're going to lose something. And I both lost something the day that I got diagnosed with a tumour, but I also gained an enormous amount. And I was absolutely grateful for the amount of understanding and empathy that I was able to build with other people who had experienced that. And there's something in the loss that we don't need to be afraid of, that we can actually find in ourselves the courage to build connection through loss. And I think that what you do in just outlining that, we won't have time to go into the great detail of. I can tell you, it's quite a ride. But I think what I think is really important for us to know is what is locked in and what are we working to save? Why are you staying up so late at night, keeping on doing this work?
Okay, I'll try with that. I guess so. We've had 1.2 degrees of global warming so far, and as we can see, the impacts are escalating, and so obviously we need to stabilise that degree of warming. But the thing is that when you actually do start reducing emissions, temperature starts to stabilise. So there's no real evidence for this runaway climate change where we're going into a full-on hothouse Earth and methane bulbs are going off, and that's that. We would like to avoid that, right? So that's actually the whole point of the IPCC. It steps through the different levels of warming and basically shows you the different projections associated with that. And so right now, there is a certain degree of committed sea level rise. There's a certain degree of ecosystem loss. And then when you start to get the higher levels of warming, really between 1.5 and 2 degrees, you start to see major shifts in ecosystems. So as I mentioned, the example of coral reef ecosystems, you literally see them effectively vanish between 70 and 90% at 1.5 degrees and 99% at 2 degrees. Then there's the Amazon basin as well, if that tips in terms of being a carbon sink. And so we really want to avoid these things, right? So right now we know that there's a certain degree of warming that's locked in, but how bad we let things get is very much what the scientific community is urgently trying to convey to the public as to what do we do about that. So, and I think when I was writing this book, and that's why the book is actually broken into 3 sections, which I've termed the head, the heart, and the whole. So it's important to understand things on an intellectual level. We need to know the numbers. We need to know how bad is it. But then we actually need to process that in an emotional way, which is really a whole other thing. And I guess that's where I think my book is a permission slip for other people to start to find a place, an oasis, if you like, to realise that, if you do care about all these things I've been talking about, that it's an entirely rational response. It's a really distressing situation. And because it's so big, it's really overwhelming, right? But we have to find a way through. We must find a way through, And there's a chapter in there, another one that was a really particularly difficult chapter to write, was about intergenerational damage. So anyone with young kids in the room or young people in their lives understands that just failure is not an option. We can't just destabilise the planet and leave the young generation to clean up the mess. And so it's one of these things that I personally feel like that's a moral issue that's actually got nothing to do with science. So if we want to show our children David Attenborough documentaries instead of the real Great Barrier Reef or tropical rainforests or glaciers and things like that, well, you know, that's a choice we have to make. So again, this is about a legacy. It's about thinking about, I mean, the title of the book is Humanity's Moment. And that is, can we reconnect with that inherent sense of our humanity and care for each other, that we're displacing communities that have long associations with the ocean in places like the Pacific, that those people literally have to just flee their islands because there's nowhere to go. And that's already happening, by the way. That's not something that's happening in the future. I talk and document about the reported cases there. And so it's one of those things that collectively we need to think about our cultural values. So again, we're moving away from the area of science. This is, again, moving into the realm of the heart, which is thinking about what do we value? What do we actually care about? Are we just at the point where we just consume, and aren't even thinking about the fact that, you know, the atmosphere has effectively become an open sewer? 75% of the Earth's surface has been modified in some way by humanity's activities, and only 3% of land-based ecosystems are considered intact. 3%. It is extraordinary to actually get your head around that. When you stop and you think, the entirety of humanity's exploitation of the natural world has led us to this moment where we're literally destabilising the Earth's equilibrium. It's a big thing to get your head around, right? And that's why I really felt that from that place we have to move on. So we have to know the facts, we need to know how bad it is, how urgent it is, but then I guess my own journey, and I write about that in the book, is starting to look back into our history as humans and realise there's this a bit of an immortal thread that is woven into our history, and that we are an incredibly resilient species, and we have risen to challenges and faced really, really difficult things. And so it really is just this moment of galvanising a social movement to really step up.
Well, I think we've come out of these short-term, thankfully, abusive relationships with right-wing populism, and there was this flirtation with, like, the bad boy. Let's just blow it all up, you know. I don't care. I'm just going to smoke ciggies and hang out on my motorbike with these right-wing populist leaders, and you know, Trump, Bolsonaro, Multi-Minister Morrison, and the fact that is now, we are seeing the flip side of that. And in fact, for any of those who are watching closely what's happening in the Amazon, in October, it looks likely Bolsonaro is also going to be voted out of Brazil and replaced by the formerly very popular Brazilian left-wing president, who has made it very clear that the Amazon is one of his priorities. So we're coming around to a global system that is not defined by lunatics, at least in some of those high emissions intensity countries. But we still have Xi in China, and we still have Putin in Russia. And I just wonder, we can point to Xi and Putin and think, holy shit, like, how do you bring them around? But then we look closer to home with Albanese and a government that ostensibly believes in science, doesn't hold up coal in the parliament and ask us not to be afraid. But really, as you document, there are, like, I'm going to I had trouble defining it, but it's 72 new coal projects and 44 new gas projects in Australia are in development right now. Does Australia simply need to cancel these?
Absolutely. That's the short answer to that.
Is it even possible legally to cancel those? Like, what are we talking about? Like, should we march on Macquarie Street right now? Like, should we just cancel the rest of the event and march?
I'd love to see that, personally. I mean, maybe the lawyers in the room have more insight into that. But effectively, the opening up of any fossil fuel projects is entirely inconsistent with the Paris Agreement targets. We can't do it anymore.
So we can't do one more?
We can't do it, no. Yeah. We can't do it. We absolutely can't. Every single fraction of a degree matters at this point.
And every single tonne?
Every tonne of CO2, absolutely. So it couldn't be more important in terms of trying to stabilise that. So, but this argument gets put forward that, we need gas as a transition fuel and all this sort of stuff. But the thing is that the renewable energy technology is now sufficiently mature to be able to handle this. So if all of this sort of research and development and funding was really funneled into really supporting the renewable energy sector, then we would see those breakthroughs in the bottlenecks that still exist in terms of some of the battery storage, transmission lines, and so on. But right now, solar is the cheapest form of electricity over 60% of the world. So we don't need to wait to 2030, 2050 and all this sort of thing. We can do it right now.
And the bizarre thing is, like, when you hear people like Matt Canavan and those who say that, you're condemning, developing countries to further poverty by saying that you're not going to export coal to these places. Most of the most impoverished villages in India aren't on the grid. And in fact, having dispatched solar and decentralised solar would be much like the way that India started with mobile and not landline. It'd be too expensive to install grids. And a lot of what I think is very difficult, and I face this also in the domestic and family violence field, is the amount of myth, and in this case propaganda, that is meant to open up chasms of doubt in your mind, and also, in much an analogous way, meant to make you feel like a perpetrator. It's all your fault that the climate is warming. Don't you know? Like, you use electricity, you get on planes, it's your fault. And do you feel, I feel that when people say that to me, I feel, oh my God, I'm so complicit, who am I to say anything? It's not, you know who its fault it is? It's the fault of the people of the, top 300 companies since the Industrial Revolution who have emitted massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. But they have made us feel like it's our fault so that we don't feel like we can be part of the solution. And I can tell you, abuse survivors feel the same way. They don't talk up because they feel like it's partly their fault. And I feel like that, the way that I began with that, I don't mean to class us all as victim survivors, but in a way we have been subjected to a similar process of thought reform in such that we don't feel like we have the agency or the right to speak up about this.
It's a really interesting perspective, Jess. Something I'd like just to add as well is that the intimidation that goes on and the narrative around that. So at the last UN climate meeting, COP26, that happened last year, there were more fossil fuel lobbyists there than any other delegate nation. So, I mean, if you stop and you think about that in terms of undermining the proceedings and that sense of global citizenry and this real push to move towards sustainability, I mean, it's abhorrent to think that people are still doing that. So
and they were allowed in.
And they were certainly
500 of them.
Yeah, and they managed to water down the final statement in the Glasgow Climate Pact. Instead of phase out fossil fuels, phase down fossil fuels, and that subtlety is important. So, in terms of the intimidation, I think that there is this. There's a parallel there, isn't there?
Absolutely. That said, the end of this book, and my gosh, do you breathe a sigh of relief? Because, as I said, you work through the 5 stages of grief, come to acceptance, and then you come to the last part of Joelle's beautiful, beautiful book, and you come face to face with the people that are saving us, and the ways in which we ourselves can be engaged in saving all of us and the things that we love. I found myself towards the end just wanting to get out into a forest and feeling reconnected with the things that we love, and seeing you reconnect with yourself and engage in self-care after putting yourself through so much along with so many of your peers and colleagues was like holding out a branch to everyone saying, this is possible for you. You can go through this enormous grief, come to acceptance, come back to self-care and love of nature, and then let's fight.
Absolutely, Jess. And just remembering that, we are a part of nature, and nature is a part of us. And sometimes we forget that. We're actually just animals on the planet. We're part of ecosystems. We might have forgotten that, but we are. And the thing about national parks, and I do write a lot about the rainforests of northern New South Wales, where my husband grew up, and it's a really special place for me because it's the birthplace of the modern environmental movement here in Australia. Many people think it was actually Lake Pedder It was actually the Northern Rivers and the blockades that went about to try and protect these magnificent Gondwana era forests. These are forests that first evolved in the age of the dinosaurs, Jurassic era, and they are still there, and they're relics. There's only like 1% of them left on the planet, and we happen to have them here in Australia. And part of the reason why they still exist is because we actually cared enough to protect them. So again, it's this intergenerational decision that we make at every moment about what we want, what do we want to save? What are we going to choose to save at this moment? And I think that is very worthwhile. For me, that provides me with meaning in my life. And the thing is that there's always going to be destruction, there's always going to be... We're not all going to necessarily hold hands and everyone's going to be on board, but at least I want to be part of the group that tried. I'd like to say that how I showed up in this moment was with my full self, with my head, my heart, and with my community, which is another concept about the whole that I talk about, is also about that when we actually start turning towards each other instead of away from each other, and we actually connect about those things that really, really matter, then all of a sudden we're you use the word, commune, and I love that word, and it's so true, because I think it's this shared experience, because humans are relational beings, and the way that we treat each other, I think, is very much mirrored in the way we treat the natural world. So this abusive behaviour has to stop, which is why I also wanted to talk to you, Jess, as someone I really admire, who's done so much in terms of looking really fearlessly at the way people hurt each other, and thinking about ways and wisdom that we can somehow bring into bringing some awareness around this abuse of the natural world that's happening, and how can we try and bring our heart back into the conversation.
Well, it's that climate of care, I guess, too. It's like the result of disconnection is what we're experiencing, and what we've subjected the planet to, and what we've subjected each other to in so many instances. And this coming back to a climate of care, which is really what Albanese spoke to on election night. His whole election speech was about care, and it is what they've been doing in their first 100 days. And this whole thing of the Jobs Summit, it's so much about care in amongst that. But I think seeing how all of these, as I said before, seemingly disparate things come together, that in government inaction towards climate change, it has, as researchers have shown, engendered a climate of uncare and a feeling that one can just exploit and extract. Because why bother? The government's not doing anything. So young people grow up in this environment where, well, the government's not going to do anything to help save the environment I live in or make my future viable. So why don't I just exploit and extract what I can? It's not just climate that is the problem with government inaction. It's actually the standard it sets within our own hearts.
Absolutely. And on that point, it's about the things that we collectively say that we value as a culture. And so this is the cultural shift. This is the intergenerational cultural shift, I think, Jess, that we're experiencing right now. And we're seeing it in the younger generations, and we're seeing it in terms of people are hungry for this. And I think the federal election is an example of people wanting to step up into that very best part of themselves and say, I want to right the wrongs of the past. We need to heal our relationship with Indigenous people. We need to heal our relationship with the natural world, and we need to start caring about vulnerable people in our communities. We just need that culture of care. And so it's kind of like snapping out of an amnesia. We've just all been in this scroll, disconnect, and we've forgotten we're actually just part of ecosystems and communities and cultures, and these are things that we can shape collectively. This isn't something that we might have inherited it, but how do we want to shift that? How do we want to change that? And I obviously teach young people, and a lot of them feel this sense of despair. But this is part of the reason why I wrote the book, is also for young people to realise that they can actually be that change that they really want to see in the world. But we also have to support them as older people as well. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, aren't they amazing?
We're so inspired by you. Can you do more?
That's right. That's not appropriate. So it's taking responsibility for those things, empowering people in all different types of ways. But so the last part of the book really talks about cultural change, and I really enjoyed writing that section of the book, and I hope you enjoy reading it. It really gave me hope because, as I said, human history is full of examples of ways that we can step up. It's also full of a lot of destruction and all those other things, and that's always going to be there. But I think meaning is found when you decide how you want to show up in the moment. And I can assure you we are living through a major moment, a profoundly important moment in our history. And so I really think it's an opportunity for us to bring awareness to that, to start to have public conversations about that. I mean, I'm hoping that this book just seeds ideas out there for people. I mean, the brief from my editor was write a book to fuel the social movement. Because the science is there. I gave you some of the highlights and you'll read about them. You can't expect nerdy scientists like me to lead a social movement, right? That's not going to happen.
But here you are.
but here we are. But I guess it's just realising that there's a lot of power that individuals have and that we have collectively as communities. We saw it in the federal election. We can continue in that vein. And that's how you change the world. That's how it happens.
And we can do the unthinkable, like get 12 independents elected to the federal parliament. Now, I'm aware there will be lots of questions in the audience, so I want to throw it open to you. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I'll repeat your question, not because you're inaudible, but because we have people at home who are watching. So does anyone have a question? Yes.
21 years ago, we had a boat approach the Western Australian coast called the Tampa, and the Australian public reacted with absolute horrific vitriol, rejecting the possibility of there being people who were actually refugees in part from Afghanistan, but we just bombed. But we rejected the possibility of them coming to this country. Now, we've got an island called Java to the north of us that has more people in it than the whole of the Russia now. When we have a situation where Jakarta sinks underwater, where Bangladesh has similar sort of problems to what Pakistan is currently experiencing, and numerous other countries and places in our region, how are we as a people going to respond to that? It's certainly our pattern, and I take the fact that you think that it's all changed, and I respect that. But what's the evidence that we're going to be more compassionate?
That's just quickly for the people at home. In a condensed form, although he has a very sonorous voice, that we have a question about the Tampa arriving 20 years ago or so, and the fact that we responded with such callousness. What is the hope that were a city like Jakarta to sink, we have Java just off to the coast to us, that we would actually respond in a different way, were there to be millions upon millions of climate refugees?
Oh, it's a really good question, and it basically comes back down to whether we're moved by people's vulnerability and whether we have a heart, effectively. And again, this comes back down to our cultural values, our social conscience, and whether we want to be a nation that is willing to provide humanitarian refuge for people. But as a climate scientist, we're basically trying to say we want to avoid these worst case scenarios because they are diabolical. But the Defence Force are now looking at a whole range of different scenarios related to climate change in terms of things like national security. So it is something at the highest levels that's being considered. But again, this comes back down to, I guess, cultural values around that, whether there's an appetite out there in the Australian population, whether they understand that people are fleeing from violence and so on. I mean, it's a huge issue. It's huge. And this is why I have a whole chapter that sort of deals with displaced people. Because, there's already a refugee crisis that's happening in the world right now, and climate change is just an amplifier, or they call it a multiplier. And so, we'd like to avoid that, but it's a really good point.
Another question. Oh, up here. Yep. Not this lady in the green just before you. Yes.
Hi, Joëlle. Now that you've ignited our heads and our hearts, apart from voting, which happened, what else would you have us do? What are some other things that we can do? Practical things, real things.
Simple question, what can we actually do practically?
It's really nice to see you, Daniela. Thanks for coming tonight. I guess there's so many different things. Everybody has different capacity to do different things. In my book, I talk about a community in the north of Victoria called Yakandanda. And in Yakandanda, they've all pulled together and they've put solar panels on their roofs, and they're basically going to net zero this year. They've got a community battery that they've all put in, and for the people that don't have the solar panels, they're able to sell that electricity on. And to me, it's a really inspiring example of how we can start to bring about that sort of change. I think, imagine if we had all these different communities where we've got solar that's offsetting our electricity bills, but also reducing our emissions. I think that is something that's really tangible. Something I also talk about in my book is bringing some awareness to the food that we eat. So, for example, the average Australian and American consumes about 120 kilograms of meat every year compared to 4 kilograms that the average Indian consumes. But when you actually look at the numbers of where all this sort of animal agriculture comes from, and the raising of rainforests and other areas to supply that, you can stop and think about your own personal impact. And so there are many, many things you can do, and other people have covered that probably better than I can in terms of your individual action. I suppose it's one of those things of, I personally still believe that your political power and your consumer power is really important, but we're not out of the woods here in Australia in terms of exercising our political power, because as Jess mentioned, there's over 100 different fossil fuel projects still slated in this country. So at all different levels, we need to be thinking about getting behind different leaders in terms of whether it's on the local council level, the state level, the federal level, and realising that, you know, you can sort of shape those different decisions and get behind those people and so on. So I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Jess, yourself.
Yeah, I would just say that never underestimate the power of writing a letter to your local MP. I know it sounds really small fry, but they are actually obliged to reply. It is a really powerful process. I remember someone asking Albanese in Marrickville, why don't you spend more time focusing on the climate? And he's like, well, if more people wrote to me about it, I would. This was quite a few years ago. Literally, they need to respond to their constituents. And so it can be not even just about you doing it individually, but like getting a bunch of people to do it. Like, you know, get a Facebook group, excuse me, evil Facebook, but like, you know, or get a WhatsApp group, or get like the parents at your local school, like all band together and write something. Like, those small groups can actually make gigantic differences in that community and turn your MP into a champion at the federal level. But that constant noise needs to be heard at every level of the community.
And just that's great. And just another thing to add, particularly for you, Daniela, I mean, I speak to the role of the creative arts sector directly in this book, because before we can even get round to doing anything about it, we need to care about it. And so I really feel there's a really strong role for people that can really make us feel. And I think that we've got our artists, our musicians, our filmmakers, and all sorts of people who can really help us join the dots between the things that we're seeing around us and shifting our perspective in some way. So I feel like that's a bit of a missing link in terms of the cultural. But there's something for everyone. We can all do certain things, but I feel until we have an emotional, that visceral response to the enormity of the challenge we're facing, then we can't even get to the next step. And everyone has different capacity, of course. So I speak about that a bit in my book, but I guess I just wanted to, bit of a shout out to the creatives there.
And also, just on that point, just also write to television networks and radio networks, and particularly, I know the ABC is not exactly the highest rating network in Australia, but it does have a lot of influence, and particularly over politics. And they have come to a point, I'm sorry ABC, but this is true, where for a long time they've been really reticent to focus very clearly on climate change. And there are great programs that do it, but if they hear constantly from listeners that that's what they want to hear more of, they will also program more of that material. So it's about creating an environment where that arts culture can thrive and that reporting culture can thrive, instead of that same old idea that nobody wants to hear about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And last night I got an interesting question about the Murdoch media and are we being, all that sort of stuff. But you can also just get behind independent media that are really trying to do really good climate reporting, whether it be a subscription to The Guardian, the Saturday paper, the monthly magazine, that sort of thing. You can actually choose to put your consumer power and say, I actually really want to support that type of journalism. And so that I think that's really powerful too.
Is there another question in the audience? We've probably got another. Dan, we've got 2 more questions.
I've just got one, just relating back to your question. Has the IPCC and you guys looked at the way societies, once they're triggered into a state of fear, start to break down, and then factored the way we respond into, some future scenarios about what happens, if Java goes underwater, we've suddenly got 20 million refugees trying to come to Australia. Is there any sense of how that works, and does that change the way we think of responding in the short term?
So David's question is there a type of modelling scenario that the IPCC has done for what the impact of mobilised fear is on the population, were some of these sort of like mid to worst case scenarios come true, like the sinking of these megacities, particularly ones off our coast?
And if they're already happening with things like the bushfires and...
That's a really, really good question, and I would say the short answer to that is no, because we're really looking at the physical components of that. So we know about how many millions of people will be displaced and so on and so forth, but that is really moving into the realm of, I guess, the psychological sciences, the social sciences. And for instance, at COP26 last year, it's the very first time that they actually had a psychology section and a session there, which I thought was fantastic. But that's in the 26-year history, which gives you an indication that we really need that community to show up, actually, I must say. Because in terms of, I do my best in terms of trying to bring some psychological thought from my own reading and experience. But that's right. I mean, we really do need to start to process this in a really different way. And that's something that I think there are professionals who can help with that, but scientists are not the people to do it.
And I think, if you look at the psychological unravelling that's come about as a result of COVID, I think you could throw a rock and hit someone in this room who's lost a family member or friend to COVID conspiracies, or to feelings that they got so alienated by the experience of COVID that they couldn't stay in touch with friends or family. And I mean, it's a very real thing that can come about with these sorts of extreme and even especially sudden changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
One last question.
Jane.
Can we do 2? Because this van has been waiting.
Oh, yeah.
I'd just like you to hear you talk about the concept of a tipping point, because obviously you're trying to inspire hope, and I fully understand that we want to head off that point.
Yes.
But is there a tipping point at which hope is not enough?
Do you want to repeat that?
Yes. Is there a tipping point at which hope is not enough?
That's a really good question. Yes, there are certainly real physical thresholds in the climate system, basically between 1.5 and 2 degrees, where we do start to see things like the tipping of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest, ocean circulation, and a range of others. And we know where those tipping points are by and large. And that's what we're trying to avoid. That's basically what this community is trying to avoid, because basically a tipping point is when you shift a system in such a way that it stops behaving in the way it did in the past and it erratically moves into a new state. It's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. It moves into a new steady state. It's trying to find a new equilibrium. Obviously with the ice sheets, there are people that say that the Greenland ice sheet has been tipped, and there's also signs for the West Antarctic ice sheet. And so these are real, and there are numbers, and I put them in the IPCC in my book from the IPCC report about certain level of sort of committed warming. And so it's true, there absolutely are these physical tipping points, and we're trying to avoid them. But there's no evidence to suggest right now that we're looking at complete runaway climate change as a result of those. But it's complex science, and I actually spent a whole section talking about tipping points and abrupt climate change, because it's really important. And there is some uncertainty associated with that because of just the sheer complexity of it, and it's very difficult to model. And the other thing, unfortunately, with tipping points is that you don't really know you've tipped until, statistically speaking, and you can see it emerge after the fact. So we might be able to look back and say, well, the 2020s is when we tipped, say, Greenland. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's basically to say that we're very aware that there are instabilities that really start to emerge beyond 1.5. That's the whole reason why those Paris Agreement targets aren't just plucked out of thin air. They actually have a real physical basis for them. And actually the IPCC report, for the first time, devotes quite a lot of time and space to the assessment of abrupt climate change and tipping points in every chapter. So it's there, and we're acknowledging it. And that's part of the reason why I wrote that book. There's actually a line in that book where I go through it, and then it's like, it's pretty obvious why someone like me is sitting up here tonight.
And it's literally, as David Attenborough says at the opening of the Glasgow conference, there is really one measurement of whether this conference has been successful, and it is, did parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere go down, or did it go up as a result of the commitments made here today? And I know you talk a lot about the much more broad scale of change that needs to happen, but if you want to, Greta Thunberg has a little calculator on her Twitter, which is like, I was born at this many parts per million and it is now this many parts per million. Literally, that's like a little Geiger counter, a little bit of a clock to midnight, like the nuclear anti-advocates have. Jane, you don't want to ask questions?
She's gone, she's out.
She's going to ask Joëlle afterwards.
Okay.
So look, thank you so much. That was a ride to go through, and I really appreciate all of you being here tonight to pay close attention to where we're at. I urge you to buy this for yourself, buy it for your friends and family, disseminate it far and wide, because we covered a lot of really hard territory today, but in it, this is absolutely a case for hope. But it's, as you say, and as you quote Rebecca Solnit, that hope is not just something that you hold on to. Hope is an axe you use to break down the door. And I think we all need an axe in our hand to break down the doors. So thank you for coming tonight and using a bit of your axe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joëlle.